Hi guys, welcome to the first respiratory lesson. This will be a very general introductory lesson where I'll spend probably a little bit less than half the time just introducing you guys to the respiratory system, some of the general components, how it works, and it'll be very general and superficial, and then we'll move on from there and talk about some of the anatomical characteristics that are particularly functional, that is particularly relevant to the physiology, and some of the lung volumes, and a little bit about how those are measured and what they mean, to wrap it up. So first of all, respiration is the process of production of energy, typically with the intake of oxygen and the release of carbon dioxide from oxidation of complex organic substances. So the oxidation of the substances you will get in GI, and I'm not going to be addressing that particularly, but I will be addressing everything up to the transfer of oxygen to the tissues for utilization and the transport of carbon dioxide away from those tissues and how the oxygen gets in and the carbon dioxide gets out. All right, so these are the general components of the process of respiration. We'll start with the mechanics. This is basically the process by which air is brought into the lungs. And as you'll find out in a second, the lungs are basically just a pump. And you pump air in and you expel it out. And that's how you bring oxygen in and you get rid of carbon dioxide. Once you get the air in, you go through the process of gas exchange. That is the process by which oxygen and carbon dioxide are transferred from the lungs to the bloodstream. Oxygen being transported in, ideally, carbon dioxide being transported out of the blood. And then when we're talking about oxygen, that is followed by gas transport, where you transport the oxygen to the tissues, where it is picked up by the tissues, and the tissues release carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is picked up by the blood. The blood is returned to the lungs, and you start all over again with with the mechanics, and in this case, you're bringing the carbon dioxide into the lungs and out. The control of this process is in the respiratory centers of the brain. It does alter both ventilation, that is the rate at which you bring gas into the lungs, and the blood flow through the lungs. Okay, and you know something about how it alters the blood flow already through the cardiovascular part of the vital fluids course. So I said, in terms of the mechanics, that the lung is a pump, and it basically is. But it's different from the heart, so this would be kind of like a functional representation of how the heart works. The blood flows in, the heart contracts, it increases the pressure, and the blood flows out, and these one-way valves keep everything moving in one direction. So you have an inflow through an intake and an outflow through an outtake, let's say from the atrium to the ventricle, from the ventricle to the aorta. Okay? The lungs are different. They have one opening, and that is for both influx and outflux, basically the trachea in the mouth. Okay, there are no valves present, and you're basically pumping air in, and then you're pumping it out in the opposite direction. Okay, mechanically, the process of bringing air in is the process of inspiration. When you inspire, you contract your respiratory muscles, primarily the diaphragm. The diaphragm usually sticks up into the chest cavity, and when you contract it, it flattens out and it expands the volume of the chest cavity. At the same time, muscles that you'll learn a lot more about in anatomy contract and raise the ribs. And the net effect is to increase the volume of the chest cavity, and that creates a negative pressure. So air is like blood. It flows from high pressure to low pressure. In this case, it's flowing from high pressure at your mouth, which is atmospheric, to low pressure in your lungs. Because when you expand the chest cavity, you actually drop the pressure in the chest cavity. It actually generates a negative pressure. And so air will flow from the mouth into the negative pressure into the lungs, okay? From high pressure to low pressure, that's inspiration. Expiration, if it's normal expiration, not like forced or, not like you're running or anything like that, if it's just, you and me chatting, that takes place really through the process of muscle relaxation. So when the muscles relax, the diaphragm relaxes, it sticks back up into the chest cavity. The muscles of the chest wall relax, the chest wall comes back down through its own elastic recoil. And that creates pressure in the chest cavity as that happens. The chest wall's pressing down, the diaphragm's pressing up, and that creates pressure here. So now the pressure in the lungs is higher than atmospheric. And so the air moves from high pressure in the lungs to low pressure at your mouth, and you expire, okay? And that's basically respiratory mechanics in a nutshell. So if we look at gas exchange, the alveolus is where this takes place, more or less, the alveolar unit. This is sort of a representation of the interface of the alveolus is here. It's full of air. This is the blood with capillaries in it. And then after the blood is carried away from the lungs, you go to the tissues. So here are the cells here in the tissues. And this is how it all sort of works in a functional representation. So the oxygen that's brought in fresh air diffuses into the blood across the alveolar membrane here, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveolus during respiration, okay? There is, as you can see, a gas-liquid interface here, so the blood and the interstitial fluid is liquid, and then of course you've got the air in the alveolus. That actually generates surface tension. And that's reasonably important. Surface tension resists inflation of the lungs, and it can cause a problem. We'll talk later on in later lectures about how surfactant makes that better and makes that process easier, and a little bit about what happens when there's not enough surfactant. Certainly the pathophysiologist and the pathologist will talk to you about that. Okay? Gas moves by diffusion down its partial pressure gradient. So this term partial pressure is something that we'll talk a lot about later. For now, just figure that it's gas concentration and leave it at that, okay? So what we're really talking about is diffusion down a concentration gradient for the moment. That will suffice. Because we're talking about diffusion here, anything that increases the distance of diffusion can cause a problem, like edema or water in the alveolus. Okay, that can become an issue. And for instance, in pneumonia or pulmonary hypertension, if you've got congestive heart failure, part of the reason why you have a problem in these diseases is because you've increased the distance of diffusion here by adding a bunch of water and edema to the tissues. Okay, and that can have a drastic effect on gas exchange. Remember, distances of diffusion have to be kept small, and when you increase them, things slow down quite a lot, okay? Blood flows through all parts of the lungs, and the perfusion is strongly influenced by gravity. We've addressed that a little bit when we talked about the pulmonary circulation and vital fluids. You've got a very low pressure system. You've got a lot of compliance in the walls of those vessels, and gravity pulling down can make a big difference in how the blood flows through the lungs. And ideally, respiratory gases move in opposite directions. So oxygen moves from the alveolus to the blood. Then when the blood is carried to the tissues, it moves from the blood to the cells. Carbon dioxide goes the other way, from cells to blood, and then it's carried to the lungs and expelled out through the alveolus, okay? And I just said that. Gas moves by diffusion. It moves by diffusion in the tissues as well as the alveolus. Okay, bear that in mind. Cannot be borne in mind enough. And finally, gas exchange is facilitated by a balance between ventilation, that is the rate at which you breathe air in and out, and perfusion, that is blood flow. So optimally, you want regions of lung which have a high ventilation, that is they're getting exposed to a lot of oxygen, to have a lot of blood flow. And you want regions that are naturally less well ventilated to have maybe less blood flow. Optimally, that's what you want. You want a balance between the two. We have a whole lecture on that, or a whole lesson on that. So we'll get to it. All right. Most of the oxygen is carried by the hemoglobin. There's a little bit sort of dissolved in the plasma, and that little bit that is dissolved in the plasma is important. We'll talk a lot about that, but you should bear in mind that the vast majority of it is carried by hemoglobin. Most of the carbon dioxide is brought into the blood and it's converted to bicarb or carbamino complexes, which basically means carbon dioxide bound to proteins. We'll talk a little bit about that later too. All this, almost all of it, we'll talk a lot more about later. We have things like temperature and pH, 2,3-DPG. These things affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, and they can change the gas transfer in the lungs, because they can make it either make oxygen bind more tightly or more loosely. And if it's binding more loosely, it's easier to get rid of oxygen, or it's easier to get rid of oxygen in the tissues. And if it's bound more tightly, then it's going to hang on to that oxygen more tightly and make it more difficult. So these are things to bear in mind, and again, we'll talk a lot about that later. Okay, and gas moves by diffusion down its partial pressure gradient. So once again, this is basically, I already said this, it's basically equivalent to concentration. When we talk about control of the respiratory system, you have two regulated variables. So remember, in vital fluids, we talked about the fact that your cardiovascular system is tuned to regulate mean arterial pressure. And it does what it can to keep that constant. Well, your respiratory system actually has two variables that it regulates, which makes this system a little bit more complicated than the cardiovascular system. Your system tries to keep arterial oxygen, that is oxygen dissolved in the plasma, at 100 millimeters of mercury. We call that the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. So again, for now, think of that as oxygen concentration. So if the partial pressure is higher than 100, that means the concentration of oxygen dissolved in the plasma is higher. If the partial pressure is lower, that means that there's less oxygen dissolved in the blood. Okay, and optimally you want this to be at about 100. And you optimally want the arterial carbon dioxide to be up at a partial pressure of about 40, okay? And so you have centers within your brain and within your periphery. In the periphery, it's mostly in the carotids, which detect these gases, okay? And they tell the control centers in the brain center what the concentrations are of these gases, what the partial pressures are, and your central nervous system alters respiration based upon what it sees here. So for instance, the main driver ordinarily, and you and I just sitting at rest, is carbon dioxide, okay? And the carbon dioxide is detected by the central chemoreceptors. And if the carbon dioxide is high, then what your respiratory system will do is it'll increase the ventilation rate. In this case, VE, minute ventilation, okay? Minute ventilation is the frequency with which you inspire and expire. VT is your tidal volume, that is the amount of gas that you bring in and breathe out in one breath. So you increase the minute ventilation by increasing the frequency and the tidal volume when the carbon dioxide in the blood is too high and you want to blow off more carbon dioxide. You want that carbon dioxide that's being transferred from the blood to be blown out of the lungs more quickly. On the other hand, when, I should note again, oxygen is regulated. It's not the main driver ordinarily, but PaO2 always has some sort of an effect. And when it really drops very low, it actually becomes the main driver of the respiratory system. In other words, no matter what the carbon dioxide is, if the oxygen is like life-threateningly low, you'll increase your ventilation rate. To get more oxygen in, your system is smart enough to know that it has to do that. Okay? Okay, so that's the end of our first video in this lesson. We'll move on to some of the lung volumes and some of the functional anatomy in the next video. Thank you.